Hey guys, it's Old Man, and welcome to the first kind of real part of this like masterclass thing, whatever I'm calling it, I'm going to be doing. And today I want to take you over just immersion in general. So like I said in the last kind of thing, like in the introductory part of this entire thing is going to be immersion learning. You know, learning Japanese based on immersion. It won't be based on textbooks or anything like that if you're coming from, you know, outside of the immersion learning community. It's not going to be based on textbooks or stuff like that. It's going to be, you know, like traditional learning. It won't be anything like that. It's going to be based on immersing in the language and direct contact with the language in order to, you know, pick up the language. So first of all, like, why immersion? Why would you pick immersion over anything else? You know, for those of you who already know this, go in the description. There's going to be timestamps, you know, skip ahead. But for people who don't know why you would use immersion, the reason is because think of it this way. If language is a tool to communicate, and it's the you know, predominant way in which everyone communicates with each other in a certain culture, why would you learn it completely separated from its use and its culture? To me, it doesn't make sense to use it in use a textbook or anything like that when you can use just use the actual language itself in forms of, you know, different kinds of media and stuff. And like even in the traditional language space, you'll see people say, okay, going over to the country will help you learn the language. And of course it will. And not everyone has the opportunity to do that, you know? Like when I learned Japanese, I was able to reach a really, really high level, but I never went over there until I was already fluent in the language, because I wasn't able to. You know, not everyone has the opportunity to directly go over there and learn it. So you say, what's good about being over there? You've got an environment where the entire of the environment is set in that language, and also you're able to interact with people in that language. And just being there, your brain realizes very quickly it needs to know that. So to emulate that environment, you need to surround yourself artificially with Japanese, and as well, you need to be speaking and, you know, using the language as a tool to communicate with people as well. So the reason why we use immersion and why immersion is such a powerful tool is because it emulates that environment of being placed inside of a space where the only form of communication is that language. Then you might ask, what is immersion? Immersion is, you know, listening, reading, anything like that. Well, those are the two types of immersion, isn't it? You got listening, you know, listening to audio, and then you've got reading books and all things like that. And in this part today, I'm going to take you through the different kinds of immersion and how it can be used to further your progress in a language. Now with reading, this guide and this kind of masterclass thing that I'm doing here isn't going to be mainly focused on reading. If anything, out of those two, it's going to be focused on listening. For the reason for that is, of course, is that that's how I learned. And if you're using it as a tool to communicate, especially through, you know, verbal tool where you're like actually talking to people and stuff, of course, listening is going to be a better tool to get really good at the language and communicate with other people in a verbal context. So, of course, you can still read and get solid in the language, but in my opinion and in my experience, the thing that's going to get you the best in the language, especially in the earlier stages, is going to be listening. The reason that I believe that to be the case is because in the early language, you know, in the early stages of learning the language, reading without knowing what it's meant to sound like can damage your output in the long term. You know, how you actually speak, damage your accent, damage many different things, because it's, you know, you don't know what it's meant to be sounding like. Say you're a native speaker and you look at some words on a page, you'll be able to read it and accurately produce what that's meant to be sound like. But if you have no experience in the, you know, verbal language and you read something, you're not going to be able to accurately produce those sounds. So if all you do is read and then go to speak, you're going to speak in a completely different way to how the average person speaks, because you don't know what the average person speaks like. So for that reason, I'd say, especially in the first year of learning a language, I would focus 99% of it on listening. Of course you can read, it's not like you shouldn't read, like you can read if you want. I would just say put it as a backseat to listening. So, you know, I don't think it's like necessary to read a lot to get good in a language, especially in the verbal context of talking to people. So for that reason, this whole masterclass and all that is going to be based purely on listening. In the later stages, I might put out like a part on on reading specifically and its place in the whole thing. But for the entirety of the rest of this, it's going to be based on listening. So in the overall picture of learning Japanese, this is what kind of place immersion has. You do it right from the start, and you do it constantly throughout the entire time. So for instance, other things say, learning kana, like kanji, katakana and all that, that might only happen for, 1 month, 2 months. Same with grammar, you might only specifically study grammar for a little bit, but immersion takes place from the day you start to forever, If you want to keep the language, you just keep immersing forever because it's just interacting with the language, if you get what I mean. So here's like a figure to kind of detail that. This here, don't worry about too much what I just put up there, but it's kind of like a timeline of what it'll be like when you're learning Japanese. I'll go into more detail about that in the next episode when I start talking about the actual process, of sitting down, learning the kana, kanji, grammar, all that stuff. But for this one, I'm just going to take you through immersion, what it is, all the different kinds and how much you should be doing. So now we'll move on to the second type of immersion, which is listening. And there's two types of listening. You've got like active listening and then passive listening, or passive immersion, active immersion, passive immersion, whatever you want to call them. Now, active immersion is when you sit down, and you say, watch a YouTube video, or you sit down and watch a movie, or you sit down and, you do something where you're fully focused in on what you're doing and all you're doing is immersing. Now, passive immersion, that is where things get a bit difficult because everyone has very different definitions of what that means. So since everyone has such different definitions of what that means, I'm going to give you my definition of what I consider to be passive immersion, and that whenever I reference passive immersion in the rest of this, it's going to be this definition. For me, passive immersion isn't just having it in the background and not listening at all. It's kind of like, you're doing something else, but it's still there and you're still paying attention. So say, for instance, sometimes you might have the TV on in the background and you're washing dishes or something, something like that, where you're washing dishes, but you're still picking up what's going on and you're following along and you're still listening. Passive immersion to me is like that. So for instance, you might be, driving to work, you might be walking around the city doing something, and you might have your earphones in or on the radio or something listening to Japanese. That's passive immersion to me, because you're still paying attention kind of what's going on, but you're doing other things at the same time. And I believe this kind of passive immersion still has a huge benefit in learning Japanese. But the thing that other people consider passive immersion, where it's just you have it on the background, you don't really pay any attention, like you might be doing bloody maths questions or something while you're listening, that kind of passive immersion, that's completely useless in my opinion. It does fuck all, I think. Some people even do passive immersion while they're sleeping, like I don't know what that's about. So like I stated before, you're going to be immersing from the day you start learning Japanese for forever. You're going to always be interacting with the language. But especially when you're trying to really improve, I think there's a real minimal kind of amount that you should be doing, at least if you're wanting to improve and actually get better at a significant rate. Where it's going to take you 1 or 2 years to learn Japanese, not 10. And the way I would structure that at minimum is I'd say in the morning when you get up, straight away before work, before you're doing anything, before school, whatever you're doing, get up, do passive immersion. So, you might be getting up, doing, ironing clothes, you might be making breakfast, something like that. Get a radio or just put something on your laptop or listen to it with earphones or something and be passive immersing in something while you're doing other things for at least 2 hours in the morning. If you don't have time to do 2 hours in the morning, do 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour lunch or something like that. But generally, in the first half of the day, try and get 2 hours of passive immersion done. Then at night, the average person at night, unless you're really, really busy, and if you are, you shouldn't even be learning Japanese in the first place, focus on what you're actually doing. And then at night, after you've finished that, you've done work and all that, and you've come home and you've got time to spare, you want to be spending at least 2 hours doing active immersion, watching YouTube or watching whatever. I'll get into later about what types of immersion is best for passive and active, but you want to be doing at least 2 hours of active immersion, active listening, at night. At least 2. I'm trying to get that in, you got to be doing at least 2. So now, as I've said, that's the absolute minimum, okay? So if you're going to be wanting to make progress in the language at a significant rate, that's the absolute minimum you're going to be able to spend and actually get good in, say, 2 years or 1 year. If you're doing less than that, it's going to take you absolutely forever. And if your goal is actually to get good at Japanese, then you might want to make some more time. If you somehow don't have 4 hours in your entire day to be learning Japanese, free time to be doing this, you shouldn't even be learning Japanese. If you don't have that much, if you have that little time, you're not going to be able to do something that requires so much effort and time as learning a language like Japanese to a super high level. Go do Spanish or something, something that doesn't require as much effort to get really good. Or if you don't have much time and you're just doing this for a bit of fun and you're just, doing it slowly as you go along, what I'm all talking about here probably isn't for you. You can still watch it and I'm sure you'll get some good information out of this, but it's probably not the kind of method that's tailored towards a kind of person like you. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean It's for people that are really wanting to get good in, say, 1 or 2 years and willing to put in at least 4 hours a day of time to get good. Which 4 hours sounds like a lot, but when you think about it, so many people spend 6 hours or whatever wasting time completely when they could be being productive. Now, as I've said though, this is the bare minimum. The more you can increase your active immersion and your passive immersion, the better benefit you're going to get from that. So you should be trying to implement things in as much as you can. Obviously, active immersion is going to have a much better effect on your Japanese progression, but it also takes more energy to do, especially in the starting stages, because you're not going to be able to understand anything really. It's going to be really difficult to understand. So for that reason, because there's going to be a lot of ambiguity in the active immersion at the start, and it's going to be difficult to tolerate when you're just getting used to it, it's also fair, fine to increase the passive immersion, because it's a really good way to boost your comprehension, especially in the beginning stages, because you can do hours and hours of it while you're doing other things, and it doesn't really feel as painful as it would be to sit down and only focus on something you understand like 10% of. So that brings me on to my next thing of tolerating ambiguity. Now, tolerating ambiguity is one of the most difficult things I think there is in immersion learning, because what I mean by this ambiguity is when you begin, you're barely going to understand anything. You're going to be sitting there listening and be like, does this have an effect? And the answer is, yes, it does. And you will get better and better over time, and you'll eventually end up really, really good. But it's really painful at the start because you understand, absolutely nothing. And like I said, you can use passive immersion to kind of push through this stage of it being really ambiguous and trying to build up an understanding before you go really heavy into active immersion. Or you can just go full on with your active immersion and just do it until it goes away. But either way, you're going to just have to build up a tolerance for it and push through it. The best way though that you can break through this barrier of the ambiguity right at the start is focus all of your efforts onto one area of Japanese. So say for instance, you've got a huge interest in politics or science, something like that. Let's say, we'll take just everyday kind of vlogs. You're interested in watching that on YouTube, like you're into that kind of thing. You just want everyday language and all that. If that's the case, only immerse in that kind of content. The reason I say this is because one area, one topic is going to have kind of a set amount of vocab and set amount of expressions that are used very, very commonly in that area. So you could even narrow it down even more to only watching one YouTuber or only watching one, TV show or something, but only watching one YouTuber, let's say. And then it's going to be way quicker to be able to go from understanding none of this YouTuber to understanding 50% or 100% of him than it would be to go from understanding 0% of YouTube to understanding every YouTuber 100%. Like it's going to be way easier to build up your comprehension in just one area. So I'd say pick one area, build up your comprehension in that, and then move on to a different area, whether that be a different topic or a different YouTuber, anything like that. Just start moving on to different areas. So those are kind of the biggest tips I have for breaking through ambiguity. You'll probably be able to find some other things that work for yourself, but just in general, these are two kind of ways, the passive immersion breaking through or, narrowing it down to sections. Those are two ways I reckon that you can really boost your understanding as quick as possible and break through that barrier of the initial kind of ambiguity in the language, which is holding you back from being able to actively immerse for large, extents of time. Now I want to talk just a little bit about what I believe to be the best kind of sources for both types of active and passive listening. So for passive listening, I believe the best kind of things to be like probably podcasts. Podcasts or, live streams, something like that you've downloaded and you can listen to while you're doing stuff. The reason for that is because there's not a huge visual component of it, so that it is feasible to be just listening to it and understanding it a lot, and it's built for just listening, not the actual visual component as well. Say you're talking about YouTube or something, whoever's making that video is expecting you to be able to be looking at the screen and, following along there. So they'll be saying stuff like, oh, that's so cool, look at this, that's mad. And if they're saying that, yeah, you'll understand it, but it's not too fun if you know that you're not going to be able to fully follow along with it, even if you fully understood Japanese. And as well, the actual, it's going to be more spaced out as well, the kind of language and all of that. Whereas if you're doing just a purely listening thing like a podcast or live stream or something like that, the words are going to, the sentences are going to be more joined together, and it's going to be more of an actual thing where it's a full conversation for you to listen to, without needing a visual component. So that's why I believe podcasts to be the best, podcasts and live streams to be the best sources of listening immersion for passive listening, passive immersion. Okay, now to talk a bit about what's best for active immersion. In my opinion, the best things for active immersion by far are unscripted things like Podcasts, if they've got a visual component, because I think if for active immersion there isn't a visual component, it's going to be very easy to get distracted, especially in the start when you don't understand too much. But yeah, I'd say YouTube is by far the best. By far, I don't even think anything compares to it. And by YouTube, I mean like actual YouTubers, not like say like a documentary or something, but like YouTubers who are doing unscripted content, just like, the average kind of YouTubers, like give example like PewDiePie or something like that. And here are the reasons why I believe this to be the case. The main reason is that it's as close as you're going to get ever online to actually having contact with natural Japanese that the average Japanese person uses. For one, the people that are making these YouTube videos, they're not professionals. If you look at TV, even unscripted content, they change the way they speak and put on a kind of act for the TV, like, they're talking like comedians and things. But these people on YouTube, they're average people speaking like average people. Not only that, like I said, they're unscripted, so you're not getting some weird kind of written down things. It's actually the way they speak. Then as well, you're also going to be keeping up with new language, like slang and everything like that. It's also going to be there's so much content of like group YouTubers together, whether it be them just sitting down talking together or doing other things. So you get to see how people interact with each other, not just how to speak on your own, but how to interact with people. You can look and see, okay, so say you got two people talking with each other. You look first, what are these people in relation to each other? This one's older than this one, let's say, and he's speaking to him and he's listening. So if this guy's listening, you can look at how he listens, how he reacts, and what he says in response to the other guy. And you can also look at how this guy speaks to the younger guy. And then when it's the other way around, you can look at those two things again, but when this guy is speaking to this guy and this guy is reacting to this guy. And you'll see those ways, what they'll actually be saying and how they'll react to each other and how they talk to each other is completely different. And then you can start looking at the different dynamics of people in groups and all different things. And all of a sudden, not only are you learning really natural Japanese that the average person is using, you're also learning how to communicate with people more naturally and have a more Japanese feel to yourself when you start outputting, because you'll know how to interact with people. The biggest thing I think I get told about my Japanese personally compared to other people who are learning Japanese is because I learned through all of this stuff that I'm talking about, is when people talk to me, they don't have a feeling like I'm a foreigner. Not in terms of just language, but the way I react to what they say, the kind of things I say in response to that, and just the kind of rhythm in which I communicate with them is more Japanese than so many other people. And that's not because I'm special or I've got some sort of a talent. It's purely because of the fact I've been observing this since day one and how to do it. So I see that all the time on YouTube, how people are reacting with natural language. One other thing is that if you're looking at, say, TV shows, at least a majority of them is going to be in standard Japanese or a very major dialect. But in YouTube, you're seeing people from all over the country speaking with slightly different accents, all different things. So you become able to understand all different accents, understand people from all different areas, and you'll have a more realistic understanding of Japanese than someone, say, who watches only dramas or movies, or in the extreme cases, anime. Now, if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know just in terms of language, really, I feel like anime is not a good source to learn Japanese. If you're into anime and that's your thing, I think it's fine to watch it, but I'd say at least 60% of your immersion should be coming from YouTube, especially or podcasts, natural sources, non-scripted, just average people just talking, The reason for this is, think of it on a spectrum. So here is YouTube and podcasts, absolutely natural, right? And then over this side is the unnatural stuff. Anime's right at the end, okay? Say dramas are probably in the middle, TV shows in the middle, scripted ones, and unscripted TV shows about here. At the end, the reason for that being at the end, anime, is because not only is it scripted, it's like fantasy, if you get what I mean. Like, take, say, how someone talks in Ben 10, or a kid's TV show, and times that by 100, and that's how you've got how anime characters speak. Like, it's not a bad thing, and every Japanese person, anyone who understands Japanese and has the context of what natural Japanese sounds like, listens to that and they can tell it's not natural Japanese, it's a bit weird, But there's nothing wrong with that. It'd be more weird, in my opinion, if those anime characters were speaking like the average person. It'd just be strange, because it's just not how it is in Japan in their anime. So this means, it's not bad content, and it's not absolutely terrible to listen to, but it can have a negative impact on your Japanese, because you're going to get used to this unnatural way of speaking. So when you speak, you're going to speak like a weirdo. It's so often I see people that come out and they speak in Japanese and they've learned purely from anime, and their pronunciation, a lot of them are pretty spot on, standard Japanese, it's good pronunciation, but the sentence structures and the way they speak to people, it's like, am I listening to Naruto speak or something? Or am I listening to like a slice of life anime character speak? It doesn't feel natural. And it's just really odd, you know, to learn from that medium. So that's why I'm not a fan of learning from that. And then to a lesser extent of TV shows and things like that, because it's still scripted. When you write anything down in the script, it's going to be different. Let's take Avengers, you know, an English movie, Avengers. I don't think you're going to sound like a normal person if you speak like Iron Man or Thor all the time. Like, I don't think anyone's going to debate me on this. If they do, like, maybe you're a bit of a weirdo, you know, and you don't really understand what English should sound like. But it'd be really weird if you talk like a movie character all the time. And it's not a natural conversation. It's scripted, it's perfect, no one makes mistakes, perfectly scripted dialogue and all that. In real speech, like you'll be seeing it in YouTube and that people are going to be making mistakes. People are going to be having pauses in their speech, messing up what they're saying, restating things, you know, saying things all over the place. It won't be a perfect sentence. It'll be like piece here, piece here, piece here, and it's all jumbled up. That's what natural speech is though, you know? And you got to get used to that. And not only do you need to get used to that, when you speak, you're going to be making mistakes. You're going to be having pauses and all that. But there's a natural way to make mistakes and there's a natural way to do pauses. And they don't make mistakes in scripted shows, you know, unless they're scripted to make a mistake, and that's a whole different thing. But you need to be learning how to have pauses, how to make mistakes and all that, and fix mistakes in a natural way. And that's going to give you an even more Japanese feel when you start to output. So you might be wondering, why am I talking so much about immersion going into output? You know, if you immerse in this, you'll output like this, and you know, that kind of stuff. For a lot of you, it might seem like, you know, common sense, especially if you're coming into this from a traditional learning background, or if this is your first time ever learning a language, it's going to make sense, you know. Whatever you listen to, you're going to emulate that when you start to speak, because you know, copy what you hear. It's like kids sound like their parents a little bit, or they sound like their friend group, you know, you emulate what's around you. But a lot of like schools of thought in this Japanese learning community, I guess you could say, come from this really, you know, indoctrinated way of thinking, where they think that, say, you can read books or watch anime and all of a sudden you're going to speak perfect natural Japanese, because that's natural Japanese. You know, natural Japanese is such an arbitrary term. Natural in what circumstance? If you're talking about in conversation, the way they talk in books, the way they talk in anime is not natural. But in the context of anime, there's natural anime speech and there's natural writing in a book, if you get what I mean. So if what you're trying to do is speak, which is what this whole, you know, series is tailored towards, you know, communicating with people, making friends and all that, you know, talking in Japanese, then you're going to be wanting to listen to things, or like immerse in things in particular, or, you know, like in general, that are going to aid your ability to output in a certain way that's going to allow you to achieve what your goals are, which is to speak, presumably. And so if that's the case, that's why I believe you need to be listening to YouTube and things like that, because you're going to be wanting to, you know, emulate that in your output, and that's what's going to give you the best results in your speech. Also, while we're on the topic of how immersion emulates output, don't worry about the little details too much. I don't want you guys to be thinking, oh, if I watch anime or a little bit, or if I, you know, go read some books, I'm going to just mess up my output, I'm going to speak terrible forever, because that isn't the case, you know. If you're doing it, as long as it's not 100%, or at least the majority, you don't want it to be the majority. If it's not the majority of your input, you're not going to end up speaking like that. You know, I get some real weird, well, not weird, but, you know, just some people that are somewhat ignorant on the issue. And for those of you who don't know, I'm going to be covering this in a later video, but there's dialects in Japanese. The degree in which they vary from standard Japanese, you know, Tokyo Japanese, will change depending on, you know, which the dialect is. But I'm not going to go too much into this now. It doesn't matter too much, especially in the beginning stages. But what I want you to know is that a lot of people worry in terms of pronunciation. If I listen to other dialects, am I going to end up with a weird pronunciation? My answer to that is definitely not. As, you know, once you get really advanced and you understand everything, you're really full into your output and outputting, and you want to fine tune it, yeah, it's better to sound like you're from somewhere. Like, I'm from Osaka, from Tokyo, and that's when you want to really focus in your immersion on that one area. But for the majority of it, while you're listening, you're going to have to understand all the dialects, realistically. Not all of them, not the really obscure ones, but in general, you're going to have to understand majority of them that people use in the everyday basis to communicate with each other. It'd be like the equivalent of, like, only listening to American English and you can't understand any Australians or any British people talk. Does that seem like you could ever be fluent in English if you can't understand people speak from other countries that speak relatively similar, you know? Like, it's just like people who learn English, if they hear me speak, they're not going to randomly, like, you know, speak one word in American English, one word in Australian. They're not going to pop up the next day after watching one of my videos and be like, oh, g'day, mate, how you going? This is just not going to happen. So as long as it's a minimal amount of it, you know, it doesn't matter really. And the dialects as well, yeah, it doesn't matter if you mix it at the start, because at the end of the day, your brain's not even going to be picking out what the difference is in between the dialects because your comprehension's not good enough yet. And plus, how can you pick which dialect you want to learn if you don't know which one sounds like? I don't really understand that. Anyway, that's enough on the dialects. I'm going a bit, you know, over the top with this. I will make a video later in this series on dialects in section 2, and that's when I'll get more into the specifics of it and picking a dialect and all things like that. Another thing which needs to be talked about in my opinion is, as much as language is, you know, something you need to be disciplined to learn, and you need to be able to not rely purely on motivation and, you know, be able to be disciplined enough to be immersing each day and pushing yourself through it, it still is extremely important to be enjoying what you're immersing in. As much as you can force yourself through it, if you're not enjoying it to any degree whatsoever, you're just not going to be engaged with the content. Like, even if you don't understand it and you're listening to it and it's got no entertainment value for you, this is what I mean with this is kind of what I touched on with podcasts, using podcasts for active listening when you're kind of in a beginner stage. It's not the best because you're going to have no engagement with it because you don't have a clue what's going on. It's boring. There's no real point to it. But if you've got a visual component, all of a sudden that visual component, if it's interesting, is going to boost your engagement. And in the end, you're going to be more focused on what's being said because you want to understand it because you're engaged with it. Again, we'll touch on this in a later stage about talking to people and outputting and stuff. But this is one of the reasons when you talk to people, what they say to you is some of the best input you're ever going to get and some of the best immersion you're ever going to get, because you're going to be so focused on what they're saying and so engaged with what they're saying since you want to respond. So what's really important is your engagement with your content, and the way you increase that engagement is through enjoying it. And not only does it increase your engagement, it's going to allow you to do more and more hours of it every single day because you're actually enjoying what you're doing. It doesn't feel like you're studying. It doesn't feel like you're pushing yourself to do anything because it's enjoyable. Of course, at the start, there's going to be that feeling of pushing through that ambiguity like we just talked about. However, it still needs to be somewhat enjoyable because even at the beginning, there's going to be more and less enjoyable things. Sometimes the content itself doesn't have to be enjoyable, but the fact that you understand more of that than anything else, that's where the enjoyment comes from, if you get what I mean. So there's different ways in which something can be enjoyable, whether it be the visuals, the content, you know, the way they speak, the fact you can understand it even. But at the end of the day, that enjoyment is really key in your engagement and how many, you know, allowing you to do more and more hours at every single day. Now, if you're wondering what YouTubers to, like, you know, how do I find YouTubers and all of that, I have other videos addressing, you know, suggesting 10 YouTubers that I believe to be really good. If there's more need for that, I can put some down in the description if you ask, or otherwise one of the best things to do and what I did is you start watching, say, YouTuber. Out of those 10 I sent you, well, out of the 10 I've got on that video, you'll be able to look and say, okay, you know, they're alright, but then you'll look in the suggestions and all that and you'll have your own, you know, they'll be collaborating with other people and you can go and start spreading more and more out and finding more and more YouTubers. Or you can, of course, search like a singular word of some topic you're interested in to YouTube and things will pop up. There's many ways to do it. One way I do suggest though is make a new YouTube account purely for immersing in Japanese so that all of your suggestions will be new Japanese YouTubers. As well as that, you can use a VPN, put yourself in Japan. You can look at the trending list for Japanese YouTube as well. There's many ways to find new content. Also, I've got a Discord, you know, which I'll mention again at the end, but I've got a Discord, and for particularly the speakers of the Kansai dialect, we have a big list of a bunch of YouTubers. And like I said, it doesn't matter if you're immersing in a different dialect, so maybe check out that as well if you're interested. It's also sorted by where they're from and as well the topics of their videos. So the topics of the video section might be really good for you. Now, in the coming videos, you know, in the following videos from this one, I'm going to go more and more into the different aspects of Japanese, whether that be kana, you know, like kanji and all that, grammar, all different things, outputting, and all these different facets of Japanese. But one of the most important things is, and this comes back again to one of those key principles of keeping it simple, is you need to keep in your mind that immersion is the key component of this entire method because it is immersion learning. So you shouldn't be thinking too much about, oh, this is a way I can learn more words every day, more kanji every day, all that and that. That stuff does not matter that much. It has its place, and, you know, of course it's important to learn words and that. But when, you know, as a group in our Discord, when we've had a look at, say, the words Hikaru uses, he's a Japanese YouTuber, he uses like pretty much about 3,000 words actively in all of his videos. So if you know those 3,000 words, which is not much, you know, when we get into how you learn vocab, you'll see 3,000 isn't a huge amount really. It might sound big, but it's not. If you know 3,000 words, you could probably understand, you know, over 80-90% of all of his videos, but you won't. If you just learn those 3,000 words and you haven't immersed at all, there's absolutely zero chance you're going to go on any of his videos and understand more than a tiny fraction of it. So this, you know, and plus many other reasons, is why immersion is so important. It's the key, you know, it's the kind of like axis on which all of this revolves around. It doesn't matter really in what way you learn kanji, grammar, words and all that. There's all different ways, and I'll give you my opinions on how it's a really good way to learn it. But at the end of the day, if you don't like my method and you want to learn kanji and all that differently, go for it. There is no best method. There is the best method for you, but there isn't the objective best method to do anything except for immersion. Immersion is objectively the best way to learn a language. I don't care what bloody study you reference or anything like that. If you're coming into this with an unbiased brain and you look at this, anyone can see that immersion is obviously going to be the best way to do things. So what I'm trying to get across here is don't forget that that is the case. So don't get carried away with learning, you know, optimizing vocab acquisition, learning grammar and, you know, spending too much time on that. You want to be spending by far the majority of your time immersing. Like I said before, 4 hours a day, that's the minimum. But if you're spending, you know, we'll get more into the time you spend learning grammar and all that later. But if you're spending, say, 4 hours learning words a day, something crazy like that. Some people do, trust me, some people do this. I don't know why, but they do. If they're doing 4 hours a day, that's 4 hours you could be immersing and you're putting into words. Do you realize how ridiculous that is? You probably don't if you're doing that, but I'm here to tell you it is ridiculous. And if you put those 4 hours into immersion, you're all of a sudden doubling how quickly you're going to pick up the language. Yeah, I've done all this for Japanese, but I've also am doing this right now for another language. For those of you who don't know, it's Slovak. I'm, you know, Slovak descent, learning Slovak. I'll tell you, I know 2,500 words. All I do is listen at the moment. My, you know, comprehension is skyrocketing at the moment. The more and more I listen to podcasts, walking around doing that passive immersion stuff, my comprehension is skyrocketing. And you can do the same thing for your Japanese by following this and just focusing on immersion. That's the point here. And that's why I'm taking so long to just explain this one area. Immersion is the key. Well, I hope I haven't missed any topics to do with immersion. I've tried to come up with every single little facet of immersion and what it comprises of and present it here. And I hope that I've made a pretty, you know, conclusive list of things and topics. If there's anything else you'd like me to cover in regards to immersion, please leave it in the comments. And I might make a part 2 on immersion, because like I said, since this is the main kind of focus of this, you know, approach to learning Japanese, there's almost an infinite things you can talk about in regards to this. So if there's anything more you want me to talk about to do with immersion particularly, leave it in the comments and I'll include that in a part 2 that I'll make at some point. I don't know if that'll be the next one. If there's enough comments, there will be, but otherwise at some point I'll make a part 2 to this if it's necessary. Otherwise, that's all I want to get across today in this video. The next video I'm going to do is going to be on kanji, katakana, hiragana, how to learn it and what its place is in Japanese as a whole. I hope you enjoy the first part of this series. Please join the Discord and jump into our community if you're so inclined, because it is a really good community. I think it's better than any other Japanese community there is at the moment. That's my bias probably, but less drama, less, you know, rubbish. It's more focused on Japanese and it's a good community with good people, you know? So please jump into that on my Discord. There's a link in the description if you're interested. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video when I talk about kana and stuff. Thanks, guys.